and energy security. My name is Francesco Ferrioli. I work in the modeling team of DG Energy at the European Commission. I'm very pleased to chair this session because, as you can imagine, these are topics and questions that keep us busy these days, keep us very busy these days. First of all, some housekeeping rules. Please remain muted until you realize that you've already been talking for 5 minutes and you should have unmuted. For your information, we will record this session. At the end of the presentation, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, but maybe it's better just to raise your hand and I will give you the floor. Having said this, without further ado, I will start with our first speaker, Xiaolong Zhu. He's an environmental researcher and data scientist at the Laboratoire des Sciences du Climat et de l'Environnement. He has a PhD in environmental engineering and a background in computer science. Today we address the question, can the EU replace Russian gas? Well, I hope the answer is yes, and with this, Xiaolong, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. I will share my screen. So I hope this works. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Today I will talk about our research on can Russian gas be replaced in the EU. We analyze the gap caused if Russia gas supply were to stop and how those gaps can be filled with potential solutions from both demand and the supply side. We presented this topic about a month ago on another conference. At that time, it is still a can question because we can still rely on the Russia gas supply. But for now, I think because of the damage of the Nord Streams, I think this topic would become more close to our original research goal, become a how question, that is how Russia gas can be replaced in the EU. Okay, first I will go through very quickly for the whole timeline. The Russia-Ukraine gas issue is actually a new but also old story. The gas dispute happened multiple times since 1990s. However, this year the story became a little different because there's a war, the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Immediately after the war, the EU countries claimed several embargoes for the Russia oil and gas. And then the energy price skyrocketed with a lot of social and economic concerns. After that, I think we all had a very difficult summer because the hot weather and the low electricity supply with the insufficient gas supply to the power generators. Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands has to fire up the coal-fired plants again. During the war, the EU still importing gas from the Russia, but what made the condition even worse, the Russia largely reduced the gas supplies to the Nord Stream 1 in July. The reason is the maintenance. And then the EU has to propose a 15% saving plan. And we all had a very big news just several days ago. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 were both damaged. And this made our can research become a how research, actually. I think the war never stops in the human history. We fight for a lot of things, such as the religions, the territories, and the resources. But I hope this one can be terminated soon. In the end, we still need to ask what's the next, and how to secure the energy supply to the EU, and how about building some new infrastructures, or how about shifting the energy structures? And what about the other costs, like the social costs, the poverties, and the inequalities caused because of the lack of the energy supply? And also, what is the climate change? Because if a lot of countries fire up the coal power plant again, they will emit a lot of carbon emissions. And of course, I cannot answer all these questions. We need experts from different areas. Today, I will just focus on how the Russia gas can be replaced in the EU. First, we quantify the Russia gas gap in the EU, and then we estimate the solutions from both demand and the supply side. Finally, we evaluate those solutions, such as the feasibility, the uncertainties, and the challenges for those solutions. I have to point out at the very beginning for the limitation and the scope of this research. We only focus on a short-term for the short-term solutions. So we assume the infrastructure capacity are not changed, the industrial sector are not changed as well. Those kind of assumption maybe not so solid for now, but this is our original research goals. We also applied some optimal assumptions, such as a perfect domestic and international cooperations. Finally, our solutions are all estimated based on the historical data, which this is not really a limitation because all our proposed solutions are achieved in previous record. So we did not make any impossible assumptions or projections. So first, how to quantify the Russia gas gap? We developed a supply storage consumption simulation model using several open data sets. First, ENSO-G for the gas pipeline data, ENSO-E for the gas consumed in the power sector, Eurostat for the energy balance, and also we use the Eurostat and the BP energy reviews for data validation. I won't go too much detail about the simulation model. Please find more detail in our paper. In brief, the simulation model assumes the daily equilibrium for the mass and the supply source ratio can be achieved every day for the nodes and the edges in the network. The model outputs the daily supply source for the 5 sectors for each country, which is the house heating, public heating, power, and industrial and other sectors. The Russia gap can be quantified based on this simulation output. For the simulation network, we simplified the ENSO-G net, which is based on operational point, to a country-based network to increase the efficiency. And with the simulation results, we can discuss the supply chains and the temporal, spatial, and sectoral supplies. First, the temporal trends for the gas supply. This figure shows the 5 major gas supply sources for the EU, Russia, Norway, LNG, EU local production, and import from other pipelines such as Azerbaijan, Liberia. We divided the period into 3 parts for our research. First is the before 2021. We can see there's no significant changes for the supply source, even for the COVID period. And also the gas price is pretty constant. Secondly, the second period is 2020 after 2021, but before the war. We can see there are some changes for the supply source and the gas price. There might be a lot of possible reasons, but I think the most important one could be the concerns about energy security with the increased distrust between EU and Russia. Finally, the period after the war, the change will be dramatic. We can see there's a cross between the Russia supply and the LNG supply. So there are some numbers for the supply for each source. So we can see the Russia gas supply actually plumbed after the war. It contributes only less than 10% for our research. I think it will become even lower for now. The LNG keep increasing and mostly almost doubled after the war. After the pipeline from other countries started increasing after the war and the EU local gas production went up, even the EU gas are gradually decreasing before that period, before the war. And for the Norway, it actually keep a constant increasing trend before and after war. And also, if we look at the price of the gas, it's actually doubled after the war. I think this is mostly because of the increasing for the expensive LNG imports. And for the special gas supply, we can see most of the EU countries reduce the Russia gas after the war. We can see a lighter color for the lighter color from the map. And very interestingly, we can find the supply drops for some country, for the Germany and the Netherlands, with a smaller circle, which means they actually consume less gas. But for the France, Spain, and Italy, we can see actually increased the circle size. If you look at this, we can see the consumption of the gas actually increased. I think this is because these countries import more gas to fill the gas storage. And for the right side, we can see the sectoral gas consumption both in the consumption amount and the shares. There are no very interesting results, but we can see there are several different types of countries. For example, Germany, Italy, they have high consumption, high ratio. Hungary, Poland, Austria, they have medium consumption, but even higher ratio gas share. France, Netherlands, they have high consumption, but lower ratio gas share. UK, Spain, and they have high consumption, but even lower ratio gas share. I want to go through all the countries, but obviously the dependence of the Russia gas is country dependent. After we quantify the Russia gas gap, then we can evaluate the potential solutions. First, we try to reduce the heating consumption, the gas consumption in the heating sector. We fit the temperature gas consumption curves for each country based on the past 4 years data. This figure shows how the gas consumption varied with the temperature. We fit a two-segment regression line. The breakpoint here showing is a critical temperature, which can be considered as a start heating temperature. Below this critical temperature, the gas consumption is assumed to be linearly increased with the temperature. We fit this fitting method is actually proposed in our previous paper, but in this research, we fit the line twice to find out the potential solution in the heating sector. First, we fit the blue line with the whole data set. This represents a normal consumption case. And then we find out the orange points, which is the lower consumption. For each temperature bins, we fit the line again and try. This is considered as a lower consumption case. Then we can calculate the difference between these two lines. The field area is actually the capacity of the reduction case. And based on these two lines, we can calculate point by point the gas can be saved if we apply this lower consumption scenario. And it is very important to point out, based on this method, we can evaluate the various scenarios for each different countries, and even for a period, we can apply different critical temperature, and we can evaluate how much percentile we want to achieve for different period. So we actually evaluate various scenarios in our paper, and please find out the detail from our paper. And we also evaluate the...
You have about 5 minutes, so please.
Be fast?
Yes.
Okay, so for the power sector, we also use the past year's data from ENSOE database. We evaluate the diurnal capacity for coal, nuclear, and biomass. We try to we find out the 55% capacity and the 95% for the moderate and the maximal reduced case to substitute the gas power production. So we find out there are 3 types of the countries. First is the nuclear-dominated country, which is those countries can replace gas power very easily, even create some surplus, for example, France. And the second one is the coal-dominated country. They can replace the gas with the coal, but if those countries shift the gas power to the coal power, it will emit a lot of new carbon emission. And for the other country are the gas-dominated country. So for these countries, they cannot replace gas in the power sector, so they might need to change the energy structure and also maybe seeking extra gas imports. Again, for the supply side, we estimate the potential boosting capacity based on the historical data. We analyze the growth rate for the 10 past years from the BP Energy Review, and in brief, from the demand from supply side, the Russian gas can be replaced about 53%, but those values are very promising, but we cannot expect all those supplies can arrive at EU. And finally, we can get everything together for each country. We have the gap supply source as the wider bar, and we have the domestic solutions as the narrow bar with the pure color, and also the international solutions. So here we have some remarkable results for Germany. Germany can replace a lot of gas with the coal power plant, but it still have a large deficit because we did not change the industrial consumption in Germany. And for France, we can have the France can replace gas with the nuclear power plant, and it also can create a lot of surplus to transport the gas to other countries. And for UK, it's also a very important player in the EU because it can create a large amount of surplus for the gas savings. And if we put UK and the EU together, we still have a certain amount of the gap left. But if we consider about the international solutions with more LNG import and also the increase of the pipeline imports, we can have a promising results. You can see here the solution is larger than the Russia gap. But the most important problem here is how to redistribute the gaps and the deficit and the surplus inside the EU. So based on the ENSO-East report, the gas transmission pipeline can sometimes cannot to be directly reversed because of the ordination problem. For example, the gas can be transferred from Germany to France, but it's not possible to redirect gas from France to Germany. But this problem can be solved in not short term, but also not long term. So because the French and the German companies are starting to assess the possibility to redirect gas from France to Germany, and it might not need massive new infrastructure buildings, but it is still our largest barriers. Here is a simple list for challenges in short term, including the infrastructure, the political, social, economic challenges. And also for the climate target, if we estimate the extra carbon emission based on our proposed emissions, substituting gas with alternative source, there will emit 159 megatons carbon dioxide per year, which is equivalent to 6% of the 2020 EU total carbon emission. And also this gas crisis could create some opportunities in long term. For example, this kind of situation, we have to shift seeking some method to shift our energy structures to make the EU's energy structure less dependent on the fossil fuel and the shifting to the renewable energy. And finally, so here are the a quick summary for our research. What we did, we evaluated the special temporal sector Russia gas gap in the EU based on SOG pipeline data. We also evaluated the capacity from both demand and supply side to fill the gap based on the historical data. Here are some take-home message. It is theoretically possible to replace the Russia gas in the European countries in a short term with certain social and economic and climate costs. And the most important thing is the international and intra-EU collaborations. Without these collaborations, our solutions are not possible. And the infrastructure constructions and energy structure shifting might be opportunities for both economic and climate targets. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? If not, I do.
Maybe I would have one. Sorry, I wasn't fast enough. Very interesting. Thanks so much, Long. I tried something similar for Germany, but this is pretty much more comprehensive what you did. Very impressive. I wonder to what extent you took into account potential energy savings that we discussed this morning, and if this is sort of one takeaway message as well that you have. There is a little bit of a supply gap remaining, but if people change their behavior and save more energy, then it's all good, actually.
Yeah. So sorry, what was your question again? I think that's.
Did you take into account savings, energy savings, so people are consuming less because of higher prices?
I did not consider that because we only evaluate the consumption based on the previous record. Like we only consider about the temperature versus the gas consumption. So that segment of fitting is only about the temperature and the gas consumption. There's no price included. And I think if it's possible to consider about the price, that will be much better. And yeah, I agree. So maybe the gas price become higher, then people will use less gas, but also people will maybe consume more wood. So it's also another another possible stuff, like create more carbon emission, because my original area is based on the carbon emission, so I will concern more about the carbon emission stuff. Like yeah, if you're seeking other kind of alternative heating source like wood, that's definitely a bad news actually. So in this research, we only consider like based on the normal conditions, how people can reduce their gas consumption. This is not based on the economic factors, but it's maybe based on their lifestyle and behaviors in the house, stuff like that. So all the points are previously recorded. That's it.
Thanks a lot. Any other question? If not, I have one, and this: if with your model you can see some critical situation in some European countries, and if you can, did you see any?
I think the biggest problem might be Germany, because it has a large absolute gas consumption, and also it has large dependence on the Russian gas. So that's the largest problem. And also for some countries, like the Baltic countries, they are too close to the Russia. So I can say the 100% of their gas are come from the Russia for now. But their absolute consumption amount is low, so maybe they can easily shift to with other like important source. So that's are two types of country I think has the largest problem. First is I have to say the Germany, because absolute value is too large, so it's really hard to shift to their like the direction and the source of the gas import. And another one is like Poland, the Baltic countries. They are too close to Russia. But if they want to solve this problem, I would say they have opportunities.
Okay, thank you very much. Then, in the interest of time, I will move directly to Germany. Our next speaker is Gunnar Ruderer. He leads the Energy System Group at the Boston Institute for Climate Impact Research. He's also the lead scientist for the REMIND Integrated Energy Economy Climate Model, and is a professor of global energy system analysis at the Technical University of Berlin. And he will talk exactly about the impact of a sustained EU energy crisis on German mitigation pathways. Please, Gunnar, the floor is yours. Just a reminder, I will point out to you when it is 5 minutes to the end. You normally have 15 minutes to presentation, so there is some time for questions. Please.
Perfect, Francesco. Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay and can also see my slides well. I think that was a very good good segue, Shanlong, over to Germany. So my focus is on understanding well what's happening to Germany's pathway towards climate neutrality due to the energy crisis, and of course, like that has a long-term component, climate neutrality, but very much also the question how we get through the next couple of winters. So let me start. So this is actually work from a pretty large research consortium that we formed under funding from the German Ministry for Education and Research, really looking into systems aspects of the energy transition. Let me start with the kind of bird's eye view on the German transformation pathway. As many of you will probably know, in Germany we set the target last year to reach climate neutrality already by 2045. If you look at the details, a very interesting aspect is that if you understand climate neutrality as like really zero greenhouse gas emissions, there is of course the CO2 related or like energy related CO2 emissions here in the blue shades, but we also have of course some non-CO2 emissions, mostly from agriculture. But then what's notable in Germany is that we have very limited carbon dioxide removal potentials. And that actually means like they are barely enough to offset these non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, which then means that net zero by 2045 also means zero fossil. So there's really hardly any space left for fossil fuels 2045, and this is what makes this 2045 target a very interesting one academically, but also quite challenging from a policy perspective. So what we do in Ariadne is we have a large set of modeling systems that we apply to several scenarios that we look into. Like today, I will focus on these scenarios 1 and 2, like a reference scenario, and one what we call energy sovereignty scenario, where we limit natural gas consumption in Germany to 600 terawatt hours. We'll talk about that in a minute, what that means. And then we have an ensemble of models, like full system models here in the purple colors, but then also nicely models, especially with sectoral detail, for example, for industry sector and transport sector, and also for the power that we can then use to create a bunch of results. And of course, the key point is that we, by working like with different modeling systems, with different scopes, that we really have nice opportunities to learn from each other and to identify robust insights, but then also to identify key uncertainties. Just one more slide on what this climate neutrality 2045 implies. That can be like almost in a cartoon way illustrated schematically here. Like this, when we look at final energy, it's very important to understand that only 20% of our final energy is consumed in the form of electricity. It's I think, very similar in other European countries. And then the other 80% in non-electric final energies. And then if you look into these different contributions of fossils versus renewables, so the fossils part I see like the darker shades versus the renewables, the lighter shades. Really, the challenge is basically can be broken down into, of course, improving energy efficiency, but then like this almost full-scale decarbonization of electricity that we need to reach by 2030. And then based on that, a very, very large scale electrification of energy demands, along with the defossilization of the remaining non-electric energy demands, for example, using hydrogen and syn fuels. And we had a bunch of models that we applied. We had also like quite some scenario variations, but more or less like this qualitative picture is extremely robust. So that's quite helpful as a background. So what, like against this background of this long-term journey towards climate neutrality, what's the impact of the energy crisis? I think, the previous talk already pointed this out. Germany is an interesting area, and in some respects a hotspot of the current gas crisis. Why is that? Russian gas imports accounted for more than 50% of our natural gas consumed. In the pre-crisis years, that's also a nice illustration by Brügel, Georg Zachman's group, that kind of shows like how many arrows go in and out of Germany and how much shift actually happens there. Germany accounted for 25% of the EU consumption of Russian natural gas. Of course, it's also the landing point of the Nord Stream pipelines, which makes it particularly important. And we also don't have any domestic LNG import capacities. So we really rely on our European neighbors here. We have a concurrent phase out of nuclear and coal power generation, which figures to be relevant. And also we have pretty high demand for building heating just because of the climate, and also high natural gas demand for industry. So like it's a bit of a perfect storm in many ways regarding the gas situation. Of course, gas crisis can be mostly characterized in terms of what's going on the markets. What we've seen is an up to 10-fold increase of gas prices relative to early the first quarter in 2021. You all know that. You all know also that that we have seen a bit of relaxation over the past couple of weeks, which is of course good news. But then also what's interesting to point out that there's a huge spread between US and EU prices, which basically points to bottlenecks in LNG supply chains. And there's also a bit of a spread between the TTF, so Southern European gas prices, and for example, Asian ones, which also points to the problems that we have with our import capacities. Like these extremely high energy prices, they have severe impacts. And there's one study done by colleagues of ours at the Mercator Institute in Berlin, which I find extremely striking, which looked at the incidence of energy price increases on different households, broken down in different deciles, like from the poorest 10% to the richest 10%. And what we see, especially for households with gas heating, you're talking about cost of thousands of euros per household, and that can make up to like a quarter of household expenditure for these poorest households. And so that's really like a huge time bomb ticking in terms of social and inequality problems that we might face here. If we then look at what happens on the markets, I think it's very important also to point out that there's a substantial difference between what's happening on the supply side. And there we actually see quite successful upscaling of non-Russian gas imports. So this is data on LNG imports to Europe. And of course, yeah, we actually do see quite substantial increase of these LNG import amounts that we see. If you also did a very rough estimate of what we expect as natural gas availability for Germany through 2025, and we do expect that a significant share of this substantial Russian gas, here in red, can be replaced by LNG and also to some extent additional pipeline imports, for example, from Norway. So things don't look that bad on the supply side. But then if we take a look at the demand side, it's really, despite these extremely high prices that we see on the wholesale markets, we see that these demands remain stubbornly inelastic with very, very small changes relative to previous year that we observe, especially in the buildings sector. Actually, there are very recent data that look slightly more encouraging, but the overall picture remains like this. We also see very substantial continued natural gas consumption for power and heat. And actually, the only sector that actually does show some responsiveness to these extremely high prices is the industry sector. That's not so surprising to see more in the industry sector because they have like a more direct incidence of the high prices and also, also greater opportunities for switching processes, etc. But what I do find quite surprising is that we see so little response in these other two sectors. Maybe from an economic view, it's also quite helpful to just like schematically think about what's going on currently on the markets. So basically what you can say that the supply side is more or less exhausted. So in Central and Northwestern Europe. And on the other hand, we see that demand is pretty inelastic. I think it's more inelastic than we hoped it would be. And of course, that explains why we are in a world with extremely high prices. But the good news is, of course, like if we are in such a world, like if we find ways of mobilizing demand reduction potentials that already pretty modest reductions of gas demand can yield pretty high decreases of natural gas prices. And I think it's very helpful to keep this picture in mind and really be aware of the benefits of putting more focus on the demand side in kind of diffusing this price bomb that we're having here. Okay, now to some scenarios. So we are in the process of finalizing some scenario analysis that we are about to publish in this month. Unfortunately, only in German at the beginning, but we will certainly also make available an English translation of that. So what we see is like in a reference scenario where we only look at climate neutrality policies until 2045, but without an explicit constraint on natural gas availability. That if you look at natural gas demand stacked over these different sectors, buildings, I forgot to translate it. So that's buildings, energy supply, mostly power and the industry sector here, that these gas demands, they will remain higher than these roughly 600 terawatt hours that we estimate as gas availability that's kind of comfortably available without Russian gas, and without paying excessively high prices, without relying on the last incremental.
5 minutes, huh?
Thank you. Yeah. Then we also considered a scenario with an explicit constraint on natural gas availability to this 600 terawatt hours. We see it's possible. It depends on reductions in different sectors that I will talk about in a minute. But what's also quite interesting is that it has kind of a longer term benefit through 2030 that because of past dependencies in the system, it will result also in a longer term reduction of natural gas demands based on these analysis with multiple models. Let me go swiftly, jump over this and then go swiftly through a detailed analysis sector by sector, which is based on a kind of really sector specific modeling work. What we can say is, what's very interesting to understand is what the division of labor is, so to say, between kind of short-term, basically price-induced changes and more longer-term investment-based shifts. And for the building sector, we see that in the short term, really what we would need to mobilize is consumer behavior shifts. And that's basically getting consumers to reduce heating levels, but then also have partial heating in their homes, etc. And that's really critical for this time span until 2023. There's also a bit of help from fuel switching, like using some biomass, also from acceleration of heat pump deployment. But these more investive interventions, they take more time to actually materialize. Medium term, that's really where heat pumps, building shell improvements come in and make a bigger contribution. And we do also expect a bit of a rebound of these behavior-related reductions. Then if you look at power generation, there really we see a significant impact because we kind of start from a lower level of nuclear, which kind of then bakes in some extra natural gas reliance. And what we see until 2023 is there is quite some benefit of wind and PV increase that will help. But at the same time, there will be the need to kind of reactivate and increase full load hour of existing coal power plants to kind of keep gas consumption down. And then only between 2023 and 2025, it's really continued wind photovoltaics that kind of helps us getting stuff down, and we can also decrease the reliance on coal. And then in the longer term, it's really, really important to also consider increases in electricity consumption due to heat pumps and electric mobility, which really matters. Okay, lastly, industry. Industry is kind of an interesting sector because it ends up kind of picking up this, like what's ever left as a gap from the other two sectors. And what we see there is quite some substantial for fuel switches, for steam generation, for example, or in furnaces, but then also activity reduction. And that, of course, brings a risk of coming with additional costs for the economy and kind of knock-on effects to other sectors. Okay, last point, like what does it all mean for CO2 emissions? So the main point is, compared to pre-crisis levels, we have to reduce, both compared to pre-crisis levels and compared to like a reference scenarios without kind of the natural gas constraint, we do have a significant extra reduction effort that we need to go through to cope with these, with a limited gas supply. And that already has has an impact of the order of 40-50 megatons CO2 emissions per year that we can reduce. On the other hand, there's a risk of some extra coal demand because of fuel switch, but as long as the overall climate policy framework is in place, that will basically be buffered by the EU emissions trading system, and we also don't expect much of an effect on the oil market. So another way of looking at that is that we can kind of compare these scenarios without the kind of energy crisis type natural gas constraints and the world, like this energy sovereignty scenario where we constrain natural gas in terms of CO2 prices. And what we see is that because gas is so scarce, we do need lower CO2 prices overall to reach the same amount of emission reductions. And that kind of gives us also an indication about the level of synergies between the climate policy agenda and the energy sovereignty agenda. Okay, so that brings me to my conclusions. Just, I think it's very important to point out how big these challenges are to social cohesion, distributional impacts, economy, but then also geopolitical sovereignty that come with the gas crisis. It's really important to prioritize the consumption side, the demand side, in the near term, like more so than has been done before, like in particular buildings, heating, electricity generation, industry, other sectors where we have these potentials. And that's very important because it will mitigate the price increases. It will also mitigate the impacts that we have on the manufacturing sectors and GDP, because the more we manage to reduce our gas demand for buildings, the less we have to shut down production in the industry sectors. And of course, focusing on the demand side very much helps us to maximize synergies with the climate change mitigation agenda. And regarding policy approach, it's super important to keep these price incentives, but at the same time also come up with frameworks for transfers, for compensation. And they are like direct transfers are of course preferable, a preferable way of compensating households, as opposed to price caps, which are of course very risky because they would take away these savings incentives. Accelerating investments into renewables is, of course, a very good idea. And what we see is really like in the power sector, you do see very, very immediate impacts of these renewable investments, but then also in buildings, heat pumps, energy efficiency, but these investments tend to take a bit longer. And what I would say, like from a climate perspective, it's really not as much the fuel switch to coal. That's a challenge for the climate agenda. It's much more the question whether or not we will keep the EU climate policy framework in place, like things like keeping the caps in the EU ETS, keeping also on the national level CO2 pricing schemes for non-EU ETS sectors. That's something that comes under fire in Germany, and then also keeping these emission reduction targets intact. Okay, thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Gunnar, for the very interesting presentation. Is there a quick question from the audience? Okay, if not, I do have...
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Alexander Udalov from Hitachi Energy in Switzerland. So very interesting presentation. Thanks a lot. And just wanted to ask if in your fuel switching for power generation scenario, you have considered, let's say, the effect of the switch on the transmission grid, right? So the underlying transmission grid, whether you see this shift, the kind of geographic shift in production, can cause any challenge to the underlying transmission grid, creating congestions. And then maybe also kind of a follow-up question is that, do you consider also, let's say, a potential support in terms of power generation from the other member states, right? So that basically, given the German transmission capacity cross-border, so it may receive, let's say, additional generation support from some surplus countries.
Yeah, that like the detailed power sector modeling was done by colleagues at IER in Stuttgart, and they do consider Germany within the European network. Of course, it's stylized, like we don't have like all the grid lines, but the big interconnectors are represented, and there is a shift in export patterns. Like they say, like we actually tend to export more than we did before. It, like, not surprisingly, it also very much depends on your assumptions regarding France and the kind of restart of the nuclear fleet there. But we have some excess capacities in Germany because of the coal, which helps us. Like it comes at a cost, of course, because of the CO2 emissions. But it helps us to also provide or like to export electricity. Did you have a second question? Yeah.
No, thank you. I think that's okay from my side. It's all. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot. Then, in the interest of time, since we are a bit late, I will move to our next speaker, Franziska Ols. Franziska is Deputy Head of the Energy, Transportation and Environment Department of the DIW in Berlin. She coordinates the research area on resource and environmental markets, and the research deals with international natural gas and coal and oil markets. She will talk to us about doing without Russian energy imports and still adhering to the climate targets. So again, very much related to the topic of the previous presentation. Please, Franziska, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see it all right. If not, just let me know.
Yes.
Yes, it's very much related to the previous topic, and maybe I should have even come first. I together with my co-authors from TU Berlin, sort of promised in the abstract to also look at the European market, but we actually focus on Germany in this presentation because it's still a work in progress. My main messages will be that in the electricity sector in Germany, we can go without Russian gas by using more coal, as we just discussed, but this doesn't impede our coal phase out by 2030. The rapid expansion of renewables is crucial now, and the German government proposed Easter package goes in the right direction, but it really needs to go beyond to achieve something like a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, because it's not on track yet. So the starting situation is clear, and we heard it in the first session and also in the first two presentations in this session. We really faced a situation in the last years with a high dependency on fossil fuel imports overall, and a large share of those being Russian. So you have the red percentages here are Russian shares in our imports, and that was high in natural gas, in coal, but also in oil. And we now have this big target of reducing our dependency on Russia. At the same time, zooming into Germany now, we have quite a mixed picture still in terms of electricity generation capacities. We are a relatively high renewable country, with 40% of our power generation mix in 2021 coming from renewables, and that is about half wind and half solar PV and other renewables like hydro. But also, not only renewable, also very fossil, with about 90% lignite, so domestic brown coal, almost the same amount was natural gas. Still, last year, 12% nuclear, 9% hard coal, and then 4% others like geothermal. So really a very mixed picture. And as we discussed in the first two presentations, really Germany sort of exemplifies a lot of the problems with the high dependency on Russia, the high dependency on gas across the economy. But also, I believe, with the already relatively large share of renewables and the sort of the necessity to deal with this fluctuating electricity source that is exemplified in Germany. Now, the situation as it was is changing. We have a nuclear phased out that was scheduled to be at the end of this year, but is now put a little later at, let's say, sometime during 2023. It's relatively uncertain what discussions are still ongoing. And also a phase out of coal to be advanced to 2030. The legal framework still has 2038, but everybody kind of agrees on 2030 now. And given the high shares of both of those three sources, lignite, hard coal, nuclear, this is a challenge, of course, in a situation where Russian gas becomes scarce. So our power mix, here you have some exemplary weeks, is such that we have a relatively important role still for natural gas in situations with, maybe you can see my mouse, that's the upper graph, an important role for natural gas in weeks with low renewable generation, but in weeks with high renewable generation, that's the lower graph, the green part is so much bigger, the bright green part, natural gas is relatively squeezed out. So natural gas really is sort of our balancing fuel right now in the electricity sector. Now the question is, can we even forego without that, or could we even forego without that? In particular, in the high gas, low renewables weeks. And save the gas for other sectors. We just heard of the important role for industry and heating and domestic heat provision. And could we even go without the gas also in a situation without nuclear power plants? They are the red sort of base load here in these graphs here. So we looked a little similar to what Zhanglong presented in the first presentation. We looked at the available capacities in the German electricity fleet. First looked at 2020 generation, which still had a large share of nuclear energy, that's the dark red, but which would be phased out sometime next year, and also reduced our available capacities for natural gas by those that are actually not coupled to heat provision. So those that are electricity only power plants, if you want, because we also have a large share of combined heat and power gas-fired combined heat and power plants in Germany. We didn't want to touch those because it's sort of very controversial if we really want to remove the heat provision from people, of course. But if we exclude the the power-only gas-fired plants, this is this part of the bar, then we get to a remaining generation capacity that you see in the middle bar. That is sort of our available generation capacity in next year, in 2023. And if we then assume that we have some uncertainty, of course, on the availability of renewables, and based on historic data, relatively, in the last years, so given existing capacities, we have electricity generation from renewables in this bandwidth of low to high, and the purple bars available. And that can then further be complemented with coal-fired power generation from our reserves. We have a grid reserve and stability reserve in the various amounts that you see in the gray parts. So you see we can get to a level of electricity generation about the level of our past demand. And that is very much in line with what we just heard in other presentations. So in other words, that's a little different calculation, but gets to the same result. If you look at the dispatchable capacity, that is in 2023 reduced by the nuclear power generation that is missing here, and that could be reduced by the electricity-only gas-fired plants, then we have certainly a reduced sort of dispatchable capacity. But if we confront that with the historical load in any moment in time, that is somewhere between a little above 30 gigawatts or a little below 90, and reduce sort of making sort of a residual load by reducing that, by reducing from that load the renewable generation. We get somewhere between 75 or so gigawatt and much lower, that needs to be covered by dispatchable capacity. And then we see that we're definitely in the range of what we have as capacity available. So in other words, we have sufficient capacities in the German power plant fleet to replace nuclear and the electricity-only gas plants. Now, we heard a bit already that this reduction of electricity generation from electricity-only gas plants did not happen so far. So the situation was not as good as in theory it could have been, mostly driven by the fact that Germany needed to export more because the nuclear outages in France and also droughts in several European countries increased the electricity demand from other sources, and including exports from Germany. So we still have, sorry, I also didn't translate that. We still have a relatively high share of natural gas, that's the red one here, in 2022 in the electricity generation, about 20% or just below, which is about the same as in 2021, which is the purple line. So the situation is, is perceived to be a more challenging 2023 than would have been in theory. I also want to look a little bit further, and that is 2030, because that's where the next political challenge will come, and that is the early closure of all coal-fired power generation. And of course, the German government sort of sees that as well. And I mean, we all know that what we want in the European power mix is a more renewable generation, and it's not exactly what we saw in the last years. We had a relatively slow expansion of renewable energy across Europe, including in Germany in the last years. So the German government announced a so-called Easter package in the spring to accelerate the rollout of renewables, including measures like improved regulation and better permitting, an increase in the tender volumes for renewables, an improved grid connection and grid expansion as well. So overall measures to get to an increased expansion of solar PV and on and offshore wind. And me and my colleagues, we looked at that using an energy system model, a Genesis mod that is based on osmosis, and that was considerably expanded in the last years, among other projects in the framework of the Open Entrance project that has a concurrent session right now at the same time in the same conference. So my colleagues are actually over there. But we also did this paper here where we applied one of the scenarios of the Open Entrance project, the so-called ready development scenario, which is a 2 degrees Celsius scenario. And I now want to focus only on the results for Germany. So here you see some exemplary dispatch in 2030 for Germany, where you see, similar to what Gunnar just said, we're not talking about a phase out of natural gas in 2030. We still have fossil gas, that's the red one, at least in some moments in time in the electricity sector. And then also you will see in a second in other parts of the energy consumption. And the gas may even be more important as a flexibility technology in other moments in time. So here in an overview of sort of the weekly and then the hourly data results, put together to annual numbers, you see this now in the comparison of our baseline, which is the 2 degrees Celsius scenario from Open Entrance, to which we have applied the Easter package measures, so the larger expansion of renewables in Germany, that we see some effect of this Easter package. However, it's only a modest improvement of the 2 degrees Celsius scenario. So it's not anything that brings us much closer to a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, which is results that we also have that we compared to in our office, but not didn't put it on the slides here because the difference is relatively large, really. So we have compared to the baseline, to the 2 degrees Celsius baseline, some higher availability of renewables, in particular solar and offshore wind. That leads to slightly higher electricity exports and also to some reduced hydrogen imports, essentially to some more domestic production of hydrogen, which you can see here in the turquoise parts of the bars that are sort of advanced to 2030, the moment when this policy kicks in, compared to the baseline when it would start later. So you have some effect, some visible but small effect in the moment of the policy in 2030.
5 minutes.
Yes. So this electricity-driven phase out of fossil fuels, of coal, oil, and natural gas, is not exactly mirrored in other sectors. So industry, households, and transport continue to use oil, coal, and gas for longer. So you still have those sort of dirty bars, even in the Easter package scenario after 2030. So it's only the electricity sector essentially that drives some reduction of emission, but it's really a reduction of emissions at low levels. It's maybe 3% emission reduction compared to 1% without the faster renewable expansion. It does lead to a little bit of more electrification, sort of the consumption side mirror of the more renewable supply in final energy sectors. So here you have final energy consumption in industry and transportation in 2030 on the left-hand side and 2050 on the right-hand side. And you can see a tiny bit more power use, that's the yellow one, both in industry and more visibly in transportation. But it's really small incremental steps from this larger support for renewables. It really only changes the picture after 2030. So as first conclusions, the nuclear phase out in 2022 could have been made, but obviously it's uncertainty related to the outages of nuclear power and hydro across Europe that created too much uncertainty for policymakers. The coal phase out by 2030 is still possible, and for the next years, if there's higher coal production or coal electricity generation, then it's really crucial to maintain the CO2 cap in the EU ETS, as Gunnar just explained. The renewable expansion needs to be more ambitious than it's currently announced. If really the target is to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, that should be the target, of course. So we are on a good way, but we're really not anywhere close to our overall climate target yet. This is work in progress, so we still want to analyze also our EU results. We have results for 30 EU countries, and we also want to compare better to our 1.5 degrees Celsius scenarios to really see the gap of what still needs to be achieved with the current policy package. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franziska, for the very interesting presentation. I can confirm the target is still 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Yes, definitely it should be.
Yes. And are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, is it possible? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Very, very quick one. So I was just wondering the role of storage technology, because you mentioned gas as flexibility, as fulfilling there the flexibility constraints of intermittent renewables. Did you consider? I didn't see storage in there, but did you consider at all?
It's a very good question. We actually took it out of the picture because it was a little blurry, and it also was small in the years that I just showed in 2030. But yes, we included in the calculations. So we have electricity sort of based storage batteries, but we also have hydrogen that you did see in the so power to X that you did see in the graphs. But yes, it's included, and it's really hourly calculations that we do.
Okay, and this includes the cost, the current cost of storage as
it includes the current cost for the current year, but includes a cost decrease for future years. So it's increasing
Great.
and rolling.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Any other question? Otherwise, I do have a question. Do I understand correctly that you see an important role for reserve in fulfilling the capacity gap for Germany? And if so, shouldn't those be reserves, or wouldn't this create a risk for security of supply?
So you're absolutely right. I mean, the coal power plants that I think we all first three speakers spoke about, they are not in the market right now. They are part of our capacity reserve because they are old coal-fired power plants, and they were part of what was scheduled to be taken out of the market and taken out of the system also as part of our coal phase-out program. But the regulation was such that they were supposed to be kept for a couple of years, mostly in the system after exit from the market, to be called up on in a reserve situation. Now we have such a reserve situation. We have an emergency situation, and that's exactly what they were designed for, if you want. So it's good that if you call up on them, it's actually done more slowly than I would have expected. So yes, you're right. It needs a provisioning with coal, for example. I mean, we need to import coal, and it's not Russian coal anymore that we can call up on. And it needs to be there at the power plants, and the stuff needs to be there as well. And that seems to be slower in terms of bringing it really on the spot than what we anticipated in the spring.
Okay, thanks a lot. If there are no other questions, I will pass to our next speakers. Two speakers, we have Alexander Udalov and Andrei Cheglarz. Alexander is in charge on the innovation program Power System of the Future in Hitachi ABB Power Grids, and his role is to investigate the mid and long-term implication of the ongoing changes in the power system worldwide. Whereas Andrei is a program manager at the Renewable Grid Initiative working on social energy systems. The title of the presentation is Indicative Pathway to Reduce Dependency on the Russian Natural Gas. And please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francesco, for this introduction. We had some technical problems while trying to share our slides. So, Eduardo, can you please share the slides that I sent to you, and then I will ask you to change it during the presentation.
Sounds good. Looks like it.
Yes, and we, just for your information, we will share this presentation. So at one point, I will give the floor to Alex.
Let me know. Can you see the slides?
Yes, I can. We can see the slides.
Okay, I'll mute myself really quickly.
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. Maybe we can move to another slide, please. Yes, so very quick background about the situation that we are facing, and that was discussed today in the morning session and by other presenters that. Currently, we are facing a big energy crisis, and also considering the recent developments, that brings also not many different uncertainties, not only related to prices of energy, but also to the resilience and the security of the critical infrastructure that we have in Europe. Next slide, please. The response already in the spring by the European Commission was to introduce the Repower EU plan that was also mentioned today during the presentations, considering specific measures built around 3 blocks, that diversifying supplies to Europe, introduce the measures that would allow for energy savings and accelerating with energy transition and the development and deployment of renewable energy sources. Within our presentation and our analysis, of course, we we recognize and acknowledge these measures, but we also try to have a look from the system point of view. We try to think about the system optimizations, and we kind of broaden the understanding of the system savings, looking more at the entire energy system and not only about the contribution of different actors. And here I will give floor to Alexandra. And next slide, please.
Yes, thanks, Andrzej. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Actually, I think I don't need really to spend a lot of time on some of the slides, which are just, summarizing the current situation, the way how the overall primary resources are used in Europe, right? I think we have seen already in the previous presentations quite a lot of information with regard to these points, right? Just to make you aware that this analysis is based on the 2020 data, so which we got partially from different sources like Eurostat or ENTSO-E transparency platform. And here, of course, one interesting thing is to see also where the natural gas is used and what is the portion of the natural gas imported from Russia on the overall scale, right? And I think also very important figure, which I think all of us are aware, is that there's a huge amount of losses involved currently, basically in electricity generation process, right, because of the thermal generation. So which also, of course, creates a big room for improvement. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is just a zoom into the natural gas from the previous Sankey plot, right? So how is that split, and the amount of gas which is fed into the electricity and heat. And then also looking at the final consumption, we see that the largest consumers, of course, well known. These are different type of buildings where it is used primarily for heating purposes, but then also various type of industrial processes. Please, next slide. This is also a little bit more further granularity into the various kind of subsectors of these larger sectors, industry and buildings and so on. So we see here, of course, that again, one of the biggest consumption sectors today for natural gas is power and heat, centralized heat generation, I would say, which already was mentioned today also in context of Germany, for example. Then we have residential sectors, commercial buildings, and various types of industries, right? So in this analysis, what also Andrzej will talk later today, so we used a relatively, let's say, simplified modeling approach where we looked at the utilization of gas in different sectors, as well as the potential savings capability, right? So what can be done by switching the fuels, by saving energy in terms of reducing the heating set point, or some of the savings which can be also achieved, for example, on the transportation level or in the transportation sector and so on. Please, next slide. And then before switching back to Andrzej, I just want to show a set of slides where we looked a little bit at the fuel switching. So this was also raised today in practically every presentation before us, right? That switching the fuel from natural gas power generation to coal actually, and an oil-based generation may also free some capacity, right? And here again, it's not an outcome of the proper, let's say, production cost simulation. It's just a very first step where we collected the data and we looked at annual resolution of different data sets, right? And then what you see on the map itself as the numbers, what we call balance, is actually a difference between the natural gas production at a specific hour, natural gas generation, right, and the additional coal and oil generation capacity, which can be activated on top of the actual generation by coal and oil at that hour, right? So given the fact that it is not used at full extent today, so how much we can push up. this analysis, again, as I mentioned, it's not yet a proper production cost modeling. So this is what we are kind of going to do. So then it doesn't really take into account specific dynamics of the generation fleet, right? So for example, when we talk about the ramping capability or start-stop time, so this is not really taken into account here. This would, of course, have an effect. But even without that, it already kind of indicates us where the potential surplus areas are coming and where there are potential deficit areas coming. And of course, this is a very dynamic system where these balances are changing on the hourly base over the whole, for example, winter season, right? So here you see a snapshot of one particular time instant, right? Which is actually pretty good situation. So we can see that majority of the countries can effectively replace the natural gas-based generation by activating in-country coal and gas production. And some countries, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, actually, it may create a large surplus. There's only one place, Italy, with small deficit. But of course, also given the transmission capacity, so the net transfer capacity is available in the grid, we can see that this power may be supplied actually inside Italy from different routes, right, from those surplus areas, right? So this is actually a good example how the system may operate. Please, next slide. But that's, of course, not happening all time, right? And then here you see a different tower, again, during the, let's say, winter season, right? And there you see that the overall balance is changing. So the small diagram on the bottom below the map. So it's now kind of in the middle, right? So there is an overall balance, no surplus, but overall balance at European level, right? So we can basically count all these numbers in each country, and we see that it ends up practically in the zero balance, right? So if you would have an ideal grid, like a copper plate model of the grid, right? So that would probably work, right? Because then we can easily just exchange and share this surplus to the deficit areas. In reality, of course, we have a grid and a given grid, and of course, there's very little which can be done on a very short. So, for example, when we talk about the next winter, right? So, relatively little what can be done, and we see here some of the bottlenecks, right? So, for example, Ukraine may potentially provide a large amount of surplus energy, but unfortunately, the available capacity towards the rest of the European system is pretty limited, right? So that a big amount of that power cannot be evacuated outside of the country. And the same is also true, for example, for Poland and also Germany, right? So that some capacity can be moved around, but not to the full extent, right? So, and then countries like Italy, for example, in this context, given even all available transfer capacity on the perimeter of the country, cannot actually cover the deficit, right? Please to the next slide. And then this is actually even more extreme scenario where basically the whole continent has, in general, a big deficit, right? So that even given that we can activate all available fleet, coal and oil, we see that there are many countries which are not able basically to meet very close the balance, and those which are still on the positive side of the balance are not sufficient basically to cover the deficit. And please, next slide. And here we also said, okay, what happens if, for example, in the countries which we read before, we allow to activate, let's say, up to 50% of the available natural gas fleet. And then, of course, we see that if this is happening, so the activation during the limited period of time actually resolves the problem, right? So that there are basically no large deficit areas, and few places with a deficit can be easily supported by the neighboring countries, given that also the transmission capacity is available in place. So that's, of course, very important to highlight again that when talking about shifting the fuel, switching geographic locations of injecting, generating power into the grid, it is very important to consider also that we should have in the background a strong and flexible grid which can actually accommodate all these changing power flow profiles, right? And just to close it, please, next slide. This is also, so what you have seen before, these were 3 or 4 particular hours of the winter season. And here you see actually all of them, right? So it covers the 6 months period. considering, of course, the winter of the 21-22 season, right? So the statistical data available. And you see that majority of the time, of course, the system is in a relatively good surplus. Many times it's very close to the balance. So there, of course, where one needs to look carefully at the transmission bottlenecks. And there are some periods where basically it's in a deficit, right? So it's about maybe 1/4 of the time, right, where the activation of natural gas will be unavoidable, right? So thank you, and I relay back to Andrzej.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. Please, next slide.
Please conclude because you are running out of time.
Okay. So I will try to go fast. So we will share the slides later anyway. So I will not discuss maybe the numbers here, but basically what we did, we tried to distinct several short-term measures that would allow for savings in power and heat generation. So this is a zoom into the numbers in one of the figures that Alexander discussed. And there's one important condition regarding switching the fuels and providing capacity from fossil fuels. This is only under assumptions that those capacities are made available in a certain time frame, and we do not allow for additional investments into additional fossil fuel-based capacities. There are also additional measures that could be introduced on the demand side, considering the power generations, and it's in both buildings and transport sector. Next slides, please. And looking more into the building sector, then we broke down the numbers even more to show what kind of measures from the European point of view can allow for specific savings in the current conditions. Next slide, please. But all the measures that we proposed and discussed previously, these were only short terms, because we had a look what actually would allow to what kind of long-term measures would allow to reduce the dependency, but also to increase the entire efficiency of the system. And here, what was also mentioned during the presentations in the morning, the direct, mostly direct electrification is a way in order to provide savings and reduce the demand. So what does it mean in practical terms? And the next slide, please. So these are the key messages that we would like to share from our analysis. Is the first one that both energy dependencies and carbon emissions can be reduced through this deep electrification and quite easy to implement saving measures. But of course, on the one hand, that would require some behavioral changes, but also infrastructural reinforcement, and that comes with renewables development as well as with the grid reinforcement and building the interconnectors between the countries. What was also mentioned, I believe, definitely in the first presentations, and while developing some accompanying technologies and speeding up with permitting procedures, considering that there are many available renewables capacities that are built or soon to be completed, but they are still waiting to be connected to the grid. The planning system, or let's say the governance system that was also discussed and mentioned shortly in the presentation in the morning, should follow that entire European approach. But if you want to think about reduction of the gas dependencies, or let's say broadly speaking fossil fuels, that would lead more to the planning across different voltage levels instead of planning of the electricity and gas systems together. And maybe to finish, is to think about the optimization regarding the entire energy system that would allow to deal with scarcity of not only of the gas that we are experiencing currently, but also taking into account other resources, either space that will be required in order to build all this infrastructure, be it renewables or the grids that are going to connect these renewables, or other resources that I think, Francesco, you were mentioning also, and Francesca, about water availability or workforce, that all these elements will be needed in order to progress. And just to finish and to reflect on that, the last slide, almost the last slide, please, is to show that that currently we are facing much bigger challenges. That to show you quite a bigger picture of the challenges that we are facing, and the current energy crisis can be also an opportunity to address other crises that we are facing, considering climate change, but also biodiversity. And I think that this is also a message relevant for Christina, who is present here in the room, because considering that we need to reduce the dependency and progress and accelerate with decarbonization, the massive deployment of infrastructure that we will need will also bring some environmental effects. And for the long-term planning, those should also be taken into account. So, and with that, I think I can finish. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. Very interesting. Any question from the audience? If not, if there are no questions, I do have one. You show that you calculated the savings, the energy saving by lower the thermostat. Can you give a bit more detail about that? How did you do it? What exactly was the methodology was there?
So we have been using characteristics, the typical sort of V-shaped characteristics, right, on the demand dependency on the ambient temperature. So that was our primary approach. So we didn't go deep into particular type of buildings and so on. So that there was sort of more sort of average aggregated type of modeling.
Okay, thanks a lot. And sensible approach. And then maybe another quick questions. And the same question that I made before, maybe sometimes more from a grid perspective. Do you see any bottlenecks, any point that in the case of crisis or lack of supply, where the grid might have problem, any transmission links which you think is weak?
Could you please repeat the very last sentence? Sorry.
Any transmission link that you think is particularly vulnerable? Or...
Okay, yeah. I mean, I guess there are a few well-known congested areas, right? I think it is known, for example, the connection between Iberian Peninsula and France, so that's pretty congested. Also, then the interface towards Italy. And I think also what we have seen, we didn't have too much time to look into all the numbers on that map, right? But there is in general a relatively low capacity interface between, let's say, West and East Europe, right? And especially towards the Balkan region and so on. So I think that's obviously need to be reinforced in the future. I think also the connection towards Ukraine is a very interesting area because I think the physical existing capacity is quite large, but it cannot be used due to some of the dynamic security constraints, and that could be basically recovered by installing some more flexible and controllable elements in the system. For example, some FACTS devices or STATCOMs, which can be effectively damp oscillations or boost the voltage, and then allow to move more power through the existing actually wires. So I think that's another interesting approach, that we don't need to only focus on building new capacity, but also new flexibility in terms of, kind of utilizing the existing grid capacity by narrowing the stability margins.
Thanks a lot. Any other questions? If not, I would move to our last speaker for today, Lara Alleluia Rice. Lara is a scientist at the European Institute of Economics and Environment. She holds a PhD in engineering science from the University of Luxembourg and a master in environmental engineering from the New University of Lisbon. The title of the talk today is The Impact of the Russian Gas and Oil Bans on the Global Energy System. Lara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. Let me just put the timer up. All right. So my name is Lara. Good afternoon. I'm a researcher at RFF CMCC European Institute on Economics and the Environment. I'll be presenting, this is the first results we have on the impact of Russian oil and gas bans and what could that mean in terms of the repercussions for the global energy system. We did that using our in-house model. It's an integrated assessment model called the WICH model. And we are based in Milan. We did this work with mainly with my colleague Pietro Andreoni, but also all the WICH modelers have somehow helped to develop this work. All right, so we all know the context, right? You guys have already explained it very well before. There is an Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and this has reopened old concerns about fossil fuel dependency. The Occident has put forward economic sanctions that were in some way tried to discourage the Russian offensive by not indirectly financing this war via trade. All of this has created a big price increase, about 50%. In the prices of gas, and Russia has halted exports to Poland, Bulgaria, Finland, and even other countries, and has reduced to more than a half the deliveries through the Nord Stream. We also have seen last week that there are concerns about possible sabotage in the Nord Stream. And so this is the context. We are in a post-pandemic world with already rising inflation, and the fear is, of course, that these Western sanctions may backfire and provoke energy scarcity and the rise of popular discontent. Other analysts are also concerned, and this goes very well in line with what has been presented already, that some of the EU members may increase their fossil fuel reliance to cope with current energy scarcity. I go ahead and say that we also find that this is actually what happens. So. In 2000, just to give some general numbers, in 2020, Russia was the second largest oil producer in the world and the third gas producer in the world. Around 60% of Russian oil production goes to Europe, putting Europe in a very fragile situation here, because it means around 34% of the European oil imports are from Russia, and 32% of gas are also from Russia. So on one hand, Europe and other major developed economies are fully committed to fossil fuels phase outs and also to net zero commitments. And on the other hand, we have other economies such as India, for example, whose oil imports from Russia have increased 3.5 times in April this year. The same for China, whose oil imports have increased more than 50%, and the liquefied natural gas imports as well. So this is the context. What we try to do here is try to model a world where we kind of try to see what could happen if we completely ban the Russian oil and gas, and what if Russia instead forms coalitions with India and China. So we use the WICH model. The WICH model is a macro model, so it does not have the detailed the results that have been of the models that have been presented here before. It has a representation of the economy, and it has a more detailed energy sector. It has also other modules, but they are not so important for this study. So we consider two possibilities, so two main scenarios. One, where Russia is completely Russia cannot export to any country. So basically what we see here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's the extraction of a given fuel F cannot be higher, so it has to be lower or equal to the consumption of that fuel in the country of Russia. So Russians' exports have to be equal to the consumption of Russia. Russia can only extraction, can only extract what it consumes. The other scenario is where Russia can extract what it consumes plus what China and India can consume, forming some kind of coalition for coal, oil, and gas exports. All right. So we have a scenario where we have total ban, the scenario number one, and a scenario with a coalition where there is some constraints on extraction, but still there's two very large economies for which Russia could extract and export fuels. This is our scenario matrix. We look at two baselines. So current policies, where we assume that current policies up to 2020 are implemented and have a continuation, and NDCs, where we assume that in 2030, every country that has a given pledge is able and will fulfill and is committed to fulfill its NDC, except Russia. So what we say is that Russia in this scenario is not really willing to, let's say, to care about international agreements on climate, and therefore all the other regions achieve the NDC except Russia. And then, so for each of these baselines, we have, as I explained before, a total Russian ban, so Russia cannot export, and a partial Russian ban, where Russia can export to India and China, forming a coalition for both of these baselines. And of course, we have a reference scenario where we have no ban. Right, so I know there's a lot of expectation on this type of studies to know what's going to happen and what we should be doing. So I go ahead and disclaim all the limitations of this study so that we understand also better the results that we will see afterwards. So the resulting price increase that we see in our model so our model is not designed to look at short-term shocks. So the price increase that you see is the result of a long-term dynamic. We don't have, let's say, we don't have the capacity to model infrastructure rigidity. We have something in the electric system modeled through elasticities, but we don't have a lot of capacity to model this, nor market dynamics. So we cannot model market speculation or investors' confidence. In the same way that when we model a coalition, is not a perfect coalition. That is, within the coalition, the regions still see the international prices rising. So we don't have bilateral price agreements. And for any modeler that is listening to this that has an idea how could this could be done in such type of models, please, I'm happy to discuss. And then, of course, our model only computes 5-year time steps dynamics. So more or less what we'll see is an average time year effect. And the model does not include inflation. Okay, so straight away to the results. These are the results in methane, CO2, and total greenhouse gases. The blue line is behind the green line, so that's why you don't see it. The blue line is the reference, so without any ban. So what we see is we see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but only in the case of a total ban. And this reduction in 2005, it's around 2% of total, in 2025, sorry, is around 2% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And in the case of a partial ban, so of a coalition, is almost no reduction at all. I mean, we're looking at 0.06 reduction. And this comes mainly from reductions in Russian emissions that are reduced by 32%, okay? So basically what we see here is that if we want to look at climate, these bans will only have an effect only in case Russia cannot export and not because India and China are very large economies and Russia can actually make up for the exportations that does not do to other countries. Now looking at global welfare, well, global welfare is reduced. So there is a GDP loss when there is a total ban. Okay, this is up to 0.2% GDP loss in the world in 2025 in current policies, and this is mainly driven by reductions in Russia that around 18% of GDP loss is lost in Russia. Of GDP is lost in Russia, but this only happens again in the case of a total ban. So when there is a coalition, there may even be a gain. So again, China and India are economies large enough to basically to drive the oil and gas exportations to their countries, and without a major let's say a major loss in Russia, but also in the world, a major GDP loss. We always see a region that gains. This is the region of MENA, which is a very high exporting region. It's very happy that the prices go up, generally speaking. So according to our model, what happens to international fuel prices is that, they increase. They all increase. In 2025, we see that oil prices can increase up to 6%. Gas prices slightly less, so a little bit below 1% increase, but still high increases. And okay, this here again is increase relative to no ban. Okay, so for example, when you see NDC, in NDC prices of gas, have already risen, because gas is seen as a transition fuel that could be used to lower the emissions in NDC emission targets. So this is reduction with respect to the INDC level. Okay, so price will always rise. Price of gas will always rise with respect to current policies. Okay. All right, so what happens to global energy demand? We find that global energy demand is also reduced. So this is positive reduction. And but again, the reduction is seen mainly with the total Russian ban. And when Russia can form a coalition with India and China, we see that these are very, very mild reductions with much less importance, let's say. Looking at the energy demand per sector, in the case of total ban, which is the first row, what we see is that, we see an increase worldwide in electrification. So the world tries to we see an increase in electrification. This is mainly due to coal. We will see this later. Coal in retrofitted power plants. But the non-electric sector, except for Russia, of course, which loses a lot of its GDP and therefore also loses a lot of its energy demand. The same does not happen in the non-electric sector, that suffers a lot. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Which suffers a lot of reductions. And different dynamics can be seen then in the more complicated case where Russia can export to India and China. Looking at fuel demand, again, looking at the first row of the total Russian ban, we see that oil is completely reduced. We've seen a huge increase in the oil prices, and therefore we also see a big reduction in oil demand. For gas, more or less the same, except the region of MENA, which is so Middle East and North Africa, which profits a little bit from the gas that Russian cannot export, and therefore increases a little bit its production. But unfortunately for everybody, what we also see is that coal demand increases in some regions of the world. On the other side, we also see, of course, uranium. So nuclear is always a resourceful part of a resourceful, say, technology that we could go through in this, that we could use in these cases. So, but coal is the most, let's say, worrisome in terms of climate. Now, looking at global fossil demand, this is absolute values, all right? So if we look at the absolute values, we only see significant reductions in, and this is the main message of our paper, that only if a total Russian ban would be in place, so only if countries would all agree that we should not import anything from Russia. Relative terms, we see, so more closely to this line, so with the no ban seems to be completely equal to the ban of the coalition, but if we look closely at the relative terms, this is not the case. So again, this is reduction, so reduction is the positive side, so we always see reduction of gas and oil, and also of coal in the total Russian ban. And this is always replaced by advanced biofuel and nuclear, and also woody biomass. Okay. In the case of INDC, that is in the case that I meet my targets, especially in 2030. So in 2025, let's say that the implicit price of the INDC is not very strong because INDC is only really materialized in 2030. I still see, no, yes, yeah, no, sorry about this. So I see always a reduction even in the INDC case, but in the INDC case, when Russia can export to India and China, I see an increase in gas. Okay, and this is because in some region, and this again, it's relative to no ban INDC. Okay, not relative to Kurpol. In Kurpol, I always reduce. Relative to Kurpol, I always reduce, but relative to an NDC where I don't have the ban, okay, I always see an increase in gas, okay, instead of in the case of total ban, where I would see an increase in uranium, so in nuclear energy. This is only in 2030.
5 minutes.
Okay. All right. Now having a deep dive at Europe and China. Again, we in the case of total Russian ban, we always see coal and gas being reduced. In the case of Russia being able to export to China and India, we still see gas being reduced, especially in 2025. And in the case of Europe, gas remains in current policies a useful resource, but not in INDCs. So for INDCs, what we see is a big increase in woody biomass and also in nuclear, especially in the case of total ban. Okay, but in China, this is not say strong enough. The INDC of China is an intensity target, and therefore this is not enough to reduce coal completely. So there is a little bit of increase in coal and electricity in China. Regarding renewable demand, we don't see a big change in absolute numbers, but relatively we do. So in almost all cases, we see that these bans, either partial, so with a coalition or total, they generally tend to increase always renewable, although very little. So we're talking about 1% increase with respect to their own baselines, so with respect to no ban at all. And in INDC, because we see some electricity from coal, but especially in this case of the coalition from gas coming in, we see less solar worldwide, but not the case for Europe. So in Europe, if you see here, because the current policies in the INDCs are strong enough, there's never this rebound on gas, and we always see somehow the solar energy use being increased. Not the same for China, which uses a little bit of coal and gas. Looking at implications for trade very fast. So basically, in the case of total ban, we all reduce our importations of gas mainly, but also of oil, in some regions also of coal. But this is not the same when we have a coalition. So when we have a coalition, some regions actually increase their imports. This is the case of Europe. And China actually also increases their imports of gas, of coal, and USA reduces their, decreases their imports of oil. On the NDC case, again, gas here is a very, very, let's say, useful resource. And so in case there is a coalition, there's China and India using gas a lot to fulfill their INDC. And this is, of course, good for Russia, if we see here, which exports more gas. In terms of exports, so when Russia in total ban is totally reduces, so Russia cannot export, totally reduces all its exports. China increases its gas exports, and also the USA. So USA becomes a point of an exporter, increases a lot its exports in coal and gas. And this is also the case in the INDCs, and the rest of the world also sees a big increase in the exports of gas, which is not the case in INDC, and especially in INDC when there is a coalition for which Russia is able to profit and sell its gas. So, like major conclusions globally, and major energy system changes are only expected in the case of a total ban. The formation of a trade partnership for oil and gas and coal with China and India attenuates Russia's GDP losses, and actually in 2015 regionally suppresses renewable scales up. In the INDC case, the major player becomes not oil but gas, because in INDC some of the oil has been already, most of the oil actually in some countries with strong INDCs has already been reduced, and gas becomes the most important and the main driver of changing changing fuels, switching fuels. And in current policy, oil is the main driver because its oil prices go up to 6% more. Now, we also seen that some INDC commitments are not strong enough to avoid a technology lock-in that can hinder decarbonization. This was also seen from other previous presentations. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Lara, for the interesting presentation. Any question from the audience? If not, I always talk too early, but if not, I do have a question. Did you take into account the fact that oil is currently set at a discount to China and India? What do you assume there? And would this change the result if, for example, you were to assume that China and India can get oil but from Russia, but at a significantly discounted price?
Thanks. Now, this is something I put up in the limitations of this work at the beginning. We don't have two markets, and this is a limitation of the study. So China and Russia and India still see the prices increase. So we don't have the bilateral prices agreement, which we would like to have. And if someone has an idea on how to put that into an IM, a macroeconomic IM, please let us know. This is true. This is a limitation of this study. But I would expect that to change, of course, and we would see even more rebound effect because their INDCs are not that strong and the net zero pledges are very far away in the future, and therefore they would just surf on these lower prices, I would say.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think this brings us to the end of this session. Maybe there is time for one more general question. If I can have a general question to especially the first three panelists, I would say we are still, despite these prices, we are still using a lot of gas in Europe. Do you have an idea of why consumption is so inelastic? And can you, in 2 minutes, convey your main idea on this? Who wants to take this? Okay, Gunnar, go ahead.
Yeah, I can. I think, well, obviously there are differences across countries, but for Germany, I can say like the prices don't make, like there's a big gap between what's happening on the wholesale markets and what consumers actually see. And we see there was also some nice analysis that correlated actual demand reductions in the household sector against price incidence. And they found the more direct kind of consumer prices relate to wholesale markets, the greater the near-term reductions are. That's not overly surprising, but I think it really helps us in quantifying this effect, and that will be big. And the other for the power sector, I would really say this was a very special summer with the situation and the French nuclear plus low hydropower plus some coal ships being stuck on the Rhine River and these things. It was kind of a perfect storm that resulted in a continued high reliance on natural gas, despite these extremely high prices. I would expect that to maybe reduce to some extent.
Okay, thanks a lot. And this brings us directly to the end of the session. As 3:59, I would like to thank you all for participating. This was very interesting, certainly for us at the Commission, and I hope for everybody else. And I wish you a good continuation of the workshop. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you much. Bye-bye.